All right, everyone, welcome to the Move Utah webinar series. I think we're 2 minutes until the top of the hour, so we'll get started here quickly as people are logging on. All right, it looks like we are right at 11 a.m., 1 p.m. Eastern time. Thank you for being with us, Charles. I'd like to take a few moments and introduce everyone to our webinar today, the intersection of equity and diversity impacts on underserved and underrepresented communities. My name is Heidi Goodhart. I'm with the Utah Department of Transportation, and I manage the Move Utah program. Move Utah is an active transportation planning program that's focused on active transportation planning and helping cultivate active, healthy, and connected communities across the state. We do a lot of walking and biking initiatives, programs, and projects, and we're happy to bring to you today another installment of our Move Utah webinar series as kind of a replacement during COVID for our annual summit. So I'd love to kind of take a moment and acknowledge some of our partners that make our program possible. The coordination, the planning, and the partnerships are really critical to ensuring that we're reaching and kind of understanding the diverse elements that incorporate and help develop a lot of our communities. We have a very diverse partner group spanning from health, public safety, recreation, and we're excited to kind of have a really new conversation today for the state of Utah, and an evolving one for sure. So with that, I'd like to plug our past webinars. They're available on the Move Utah website. Today we're streaming on Facebook and Twitter, and this video will be available after the fact on our YouTube channel at UDOT. Additionally, for the first time today, we are offering this webinar in Spanish. So if you would like captioning, please go to the settings within your browser or in the Zoom platform and select captioning, and you have the ability to toggle languages over to Spanish. So thank you, Pablo, today for offering our Spanish translation. We're very excited to offer that, considering that over 20% of the state of Utah's population is Hispanic. So we're excited to have these conversations, have them be diverse, and reach more of our audiences in the state. Again, my name is Heidi Goodhart. I'm excited today to be in sunny Utah, and I guess Charles is in snowy New Jersey with the nor'easter that's kind of hit the East Coast recently. So kind of a mix-up of how our winters typically go. But I'd like to take a couple minutes and kick this over to Emily. At the end of today's conversation with Charles presenting, Emily and I are going to kind of host more of an informal front porch conversation with Charles, ask some questions. We're going to kind of open it up to the audience. We have an opportunity to have Q&A, and Charles is not shy. He's open to any and all questions, and so we'll help facilitate that at the end. But let me kick this off to Emily for an introduction.
Yeah, hi everyone. Really glad to be here, and I'm excited to be a part of this conversation. Yeah, so as you're seeing in my bio here, I'm a recent graduate from the University of Utah, and I, been in the urban ecology program there. And throughout my time on campus, I've been trying to hold spaces and conversations with underrepresented students on social justice and environmental justice topics. Um, so I'm very excited to kick off this conversation today. Next slide. Okay, so I'll just give a little bit of context of what's been happening over the last year for people who don't know. So after the tragic death of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, and unfortunately many others, protests were held across the nation and including Utah to address police brutality and systemic racisms that have been long held throughout our country's history. And these movements are not new. These issues are not new, but with the increased awareness from 2020 and 2021, people are starting to show up in solidarity and asking what we can do and what we can learn more and how we can understand and be with each other more to work towards justice and equity and inclusion. Yeah, and in this next slide, we're seeing these conversations being reflected in our healthcare leaders within the state. And in this picture, White Coats for Black Lives, we can see that a group of Utah healthcare workers are taking a knee and showing their solidarity to the movements that are happening. And just recently, from an article from the Salt Lake Tribune, healthcare leaders and institutions have declared that systemic racism is a public health crisis. And they are saying how they want to work collectively with each other towards bettering healthcare systems and approaches. And with these issues of accessing health services and the health detriments from our built environment, these have been greatly exacerbated because of the pandemic thus far, and has greatly impacted many people, especially our households with lower incomes and communities of color. So just want to draw attention and awareness to that. And with all of the articles that I've been saying thus far, we'll add links to that in the chat later.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Emily. Like Emily mentioned, she's kind of been spearheading and helping champion some of our equity conversations within the Department of Transportation, especially within our planning division. And, there's a lot kind of happening and spinning in the state. And most recently, there's kind of been the Salt Lake Chamber leading this effort for a compact on racial equity, diversity, and inclusion. We'll put the link into the chat for this effort. And, it just kind of shows that we all have a place to incorporate equity and inclusion into our conversations. And so that's what we're doing today at Move Utah. We're bringing in Charles T. Brown, who is a street level researcher and para-academic who is literally forging the conversations between health, equity, and transportation. And we're going to sit down and listen and learn a lot from Charles today. So I'm going to go ahead and kick this off to you, Charles. Thanks so much for being here.
Thank you, Heidi. And that's pracademic. I am a pracademic.
Pracademic, okay.
Yes, no problem. Let's get started here. So good morning, good afternoon, everyone. As Heidi stated, it is indeed very white outside because of the snow. We have, I think, somewhere around 20 plus inches of snow here in New Jersey, but it is indeed a pleasure to be here with you today. I would like to discuss equity matters, creating safe, healthy, and inclusive transportation systems for all. I want to start though by thanking the team at Move Utah, UDOT, and all of your partners for having me here today. So special thanks to you, Heidi, Emily, and Angelo, and the great team at X Factor. My name, as Heidi stated, is Charles T. Brown, and it's important to me that others see me as I identify. I identify as a street level researcher and a academic, given my more than 10 plus years of working inside and outside of the academies. And also, just a little about myself. I was reared in a town of 500 people in rural Mississippi, but I've lived, I've played, I've worked in and with communities all across North America. Some of those communities were blue, some were red, some were green, and some were even confused. In short, I have 99 problems, but understanding you will not be one of them. Also, I live according to the African proverb, I am because we are. But some of you may ask, well, why focus on or center race, racism, and ethnicity within your presentation and within your work? Well, pre-George Floyd and pre-Breonna Taylor murders, I've chosen to prioritize the race conversation in my transportation equity work in order to broaden the narrative of transportation planning. I am strongly committed to leading and centering race in all transportation decision-making processes because, as you know, too often race and racism is glazed over in the planning, research, and policy development that makes assumptions about the communities we're tasked to serve. Instead, what you find are proxies such as income, age, sex, gender, and access to vehicles that are used as an alternative to centering race-based issues. See, the history of structural racism, the public policies, the institutional practices, and the social norms that together maintain these racial hierarchies and its impact across the country and within the communities is often overlooked and unacknowledged in some respects. Yet it is very pervasive and unmistakably harmful to everyone. So as planners, as engineers, I believe we have a professional and a moral obligation to acknowledge that the uneven development of our cities and the resulting racial health and wealth disparities are the result of systemic racism ingrained within our professions. But what is equity? Well, equity for me involves three key things. First and foremost, equity on its most basic level involves trying to understand and give people what they need to enjoy full, healthy lives. But it is also, most importantly, the presence of justice and fairness within the procedures, the processes, and distribution of resources by institutions or systems. But equity work is more than a desktop exercise. See, facing equity issues requires an understanding of the underlying or root causes of inequalities and oppression within our society. But you must go further than that. It also involves a consideration of the various social identities. This work, in short, is very intersectional. And so you must ask yourself these questions because it says a lot about who is absent from the table when you're making decisions. The questions range from which identities do you think about most often, to which identities you think about least often, to which of your own identities have the strongest effect on how you perceive yourself, to which of the ones have the greatest effect on how others perceive you. See, it's not the seen that I'm concerned about. It's the unseen in our industry that bothers me. And why so? I'll give you a quick example. I'll have you write down on a sheet of paper or make a note in your mind which changes you would like to see in this environment. For context, this is the West Ward of Newark, New Jersey, one of my favorite places. It has historically been a majority minority neighborhood. When I do exercises across the country with our professionals, I ask them the question, which changes would they make? Right away, they say, we'll add sidewalks, we'll repair the sidewalks, they'll add bike lanes, we'll add trees, we'll do economic development, redevelopment, maintenance, etc. But few, if any, mention the fact that they see no people here. And people live here. And more importantly, these people want to be seen. Because in our profession, too often we do these before and after renderings, and we erase people from the future, particularly Black, Indigenous people of color. See, we have to come to grips with the fact that transportation in many ways has been weaponized as a tool of oppression within society. You can look to the incidents of or the acts of what we deem highway robbery, when many of our state, federal highway systems basically plowed through Black and low income communities across this country. Or we could look to the connection between transportation and climate change. See, I was both fortunate and unfortunate to have witnessed and lived through both Hurricane Katrina that hit Mississippi in 2005 and Hurricane Sandy that hit New Jersey in 2012. But the impacts of transportation on us and our livelihoods does not stop there. As we know from the data and the reports is that those most at risk are older adults, people of color, and people walking in low income communities. See, when it comes to older adults, their relative pedestrian danger index was more than a third higher than the general population. And when it comes to Black Americans or people of color, they were 72% more likely to have been struck and killed by drivers while walking. And then what we see in terms of low income neighborhoods, those with a median household income of $36,000 or less were killed at much higher rates than their counterparts. And see, too often in Utah and elsewhere across the country, unfortunately, what we hear is that it's behavioral. It's about the choices that we make. I'd like today and love to challenge this notion that it is simply behavioral. I read a recent quote in KSL.com from one of your leaders where they stated, word for word here, it's behavioral. The choices we make. If we choose to be distracted either as a pedestrian or as a motorist, that weighs into everything that happens on the roadway. I totally understand why that is said. I understand the intent behind it, but I don't think we can falsely equate the actions of motorists with those of pedestrians. See, thankfully, our public health sector is getting this right. See, in transportation and planning, too often we focus on those risk behaviors. We talk about low physical activity, violence, crossing mid-block, etc., and the ways in which that leads to disease and injury, and then mortality on our roadways. But as the public health sector has pointed out, it's much deeper than that. See, we have to take a look at the living conditions and their connections to the risk behaviors. But most importantly, we got to go further upstream in our industry and look at the social inequities and the institutional inequities and their bidirectional relationship and how we get the living conditions that we have. See, if a pedestrian or a bicyclist tell you the environment made me do it, there is some truth to that. So this is important too, because we know that our environments have been designed with the intention to segregate. Whether we look at Detroit here, and just to quickly give you an overview of this map, the blue represents where whites live, the green represents where Blacks live, the purple Hispanics, and the Asians and our other brothers and sisters are represented by the other colors. When you look at these maps, what do you see? I'll save you the time. What you see is systemic racial residential segregation. Again, it is by design. And this is not just something in Detroit. This is in Houston, Texas, too, one of our largest metropolitan areas in the United States. But it's not just in a place like Houston and Detroit, it's in Atlanta as well. You can see here on the north side, the majority of whites. On the south, west, and east side, the majority of Blacks. That is by design, but perhaps you don't believe it. So let's go to the nation's capital. Again, if blue represents where white people live, green represents where Blacks live, purple Hispanics, what do you see? You see racial residential segregation. But you won't believe it until we get to a place like New York City, one of the progressive cities in all of America. Yet and still, you see by design racial residential segregation. And then most people ask the question, is there an outlier? There are many outliers, places like Portland, Oregon, places like Utah, places like Iowa, where the majority of the map you see is blue. That is by design. And see, this has equity implications. We're coming to know that race determines place, place determines health. And what is the health of pedestrians and others in the state of Utah? Utah is one of the most dangerous states for pedestrians in the nation. But history doesn't say goodbye. History says, see you later. And what's the current context of the efforts in Utah to address this issue? Well, we know collectively there are a plethora of federal, state, and local initiatives, plans, and programs aimed at increasing the physical activity and improving pedestrian, motorist, and bicycle safety and mobility among all people. However, there are specific cases of the intent to improve it among Black, Indigenous people of color in the US. And some of these include Vision Zero, Complete Streets, Open Streets, Livable Streets, and Safe Streets. However, when we take a very critical lens and look at these, what we find is that fewer of them actually achieve their goal of removing barriers to being more physically active for Black, Indigenous people of color. According to the most recent ACS, we know that the racial composition of Utah is around 86% white, 5% other race, or 2%, 3% two or more races. We also know that when you look at many of your efforts, that they've been, unfortunately, the efforts are white-centered, even the evidence-based strategies. And you may ask, how is this so? Well, the current descriptions of many of them are ahistorical and apolitical, particularly in regards to the history of systemic and institutional racism within the US. We also know that the strategies do not highlight the role of state and municipal law enforcement in discouraging and denying physical activity among Black, Indigenous people of color. Thirdly, equitable and inclusive access is often mentioned as these sort of foundational elements, but not explicitly as a desired outcome or goal with any tangible organizational commitments from the state, the county, and the local level to funding the work that is happening within these minority communities. And then there is, for the most part, minimal mention of the overwhelming data highlighting the magnitude of unconscious bias in the criminalization of minorities in America, particularly in light of the current climate. And then lastly, the strategies do not specifically discuss the need for institutional changes, not only internally, but also externally. See, these are not social determinants of health. These are political determinants of health. And what we know right now when it comes to Black, Indigenous people of color in Utah and elsewhere is that our mobility has been arrested. Now, I understand that is a very strong statement. However, let me show you the ways in which in Utah one's mobility has been arrested. You're all familiar with this map. Let's go back to showing the example of the previous cities. Here, what you see, blue represents where the majority of white people live. Green represents where the majority of Blacks live. Purple, Hispanics, and the Asian and our other brothers and sisters are represented by the peach, the orange, etc. In the city of Utah, these communities, in the city of Salt Lake City, what you see is these communities have been arrested. You look here, this area's mobility has been arrested because they are literally locked in or walled off by the interstate and the state highway transportation system. And to make matters worse, they are adjacent to the airport. What do you think are their social, economic, and health impacts from having been locked in by the interstate highway system, which was, as we know it, a decision that was, many would argue, intentional? But this is not the only minority community that is walled off by the highway systems. You look in these other areas and you see it as well. We won't discuss Dixie National Park or the vast differences between some of the other communities. But we will, for a moment, to show you the economic impact of this, take a look at Mill Creek, specifically West and East Mill Creek. Looking at this map, you're seeing the variation in income at the block group level from less than 15,000 to more than 100,000. You know the city of Salt Lake City, and what you see is that the highway systems divide the have and the have-nots. Or dare we say, the highway systems create, in many ways, the have and the have-not. But you may now say, well, Charles, you made a bold statement around people's mobility being arrested. Perhaps I should now provide you with an overview of what I mean by arrested mobility. Arrested mobility is the assertion that Black, Indigenous people of color have been historically and presently denied by both legal and illegal authority the inalienable right to move, to be moved, or to simply exist in public space. What we know is that this results in adverse social, political, economic, and health effects that are widespread and intergenerational, but they are preventable. See, many of you may ask, is there a framework? Well, I've had to create a framework for this, and as shown here, arrested mobility is a direct manifestation of racism across 4 distinct realms: the personal realm, the interpersonal realm, the institutional realm, and the cultural realm. These collective realms of racism have resulted in the social construct of race, both locally as well as globally. And they have unfortunately led to the intentional and deliberate targeting and over-policing of Black, Indigenous people of color. This includes their physical mobility, where the relationship is direct, and their social mobility or upward mobility, where the relationship is indirect. Now, for all the social scientists out there and others, please understand that I understand the direct relationship between these variables shown are much more complex and nuanced than, again, displayed. But then the most logical question to ask next is, how are Black people over-policed, or Black, Indigenous people policed in Utah and elsewhere? I want to state that I'm showing this from a national standpoint, not just a Utah-specific standpoint, because I want to distinguish between episodic and thematic framing. See, this is not a one-off. This is a theme. This is a truth or a fact across the nation. But the question is, how are they over-policed? Well, over-policing is not what you may think of in general terms. More specifically, over-policing is evident via 3 distinct forms. Policy is one. I've shown you clear evidence using the maps of racial residential segregation in Salt Lake City and elsewhere around the country. This includes racialized zoning, disinvestment in communities, etc. The second one is law enforcement, whether at the state, county, or local level. And then thirdly, it is the self-deputization of white citizens, the quote unquote Karens of the world. See, in the context of physical mobilities, these various degrees of over-policing on Black, Indigenous people of color are evident and overwhelmingly supported by the data across the different modalities that include whether one is walking, whether one is biking, whether one is driving, taking public transit or private transit, hopping a ride via rideshare, or using a micro-mobility device such as an e-scooter. It even happens, unfortunately, regardless of age or whether you're riding a bike in your neighborhood as a 3-year-old or taking a ride on your father's neck. Again, understanding how this over-policing happens via policy, via policing, and via the self-deputization of white citizens in America provides an understanding of how it arrests the mobility of Black, Indigenous people of color in Utah as well as across the country. And this is important for you if you're to create the policy systems and environmental changes to eradicate these impacts. The next question then is there evidence to support arrested mobility across the different modes? Well, let's briefly go through these and let's start with walking. The most recent and notable cases of over-policing Black mobility via walking or running in the US includes the shooting deaths and murders of Ahmaud Arbery, who was jogging, Trayvon Martin, who was walking, and Mike Brown, who was also walking. You may not recall, but both Ahmaud and Trayvon were murdered by self-deputized citizens, and Mike Brown was killed by law enforcement. But what does the data reveal? Well, when we look at the data, let's go to the city of Jacksonville. An analysis of 5 years of tickets issued to pedestrians in Jacksonville revealed that 55% of tickets were issued to Black individuals, even though only 29% of the population identify as Black. In that same study, they found that Blacks were 3 times more likely to receive a ticket than whites. And then residents of the city's 3 poor zip codes were about 6 times as likely to receive a pedestrian citation as those living in the city's other more affluent 34 zip codes. And in the case of Raquel Nelson, a Black single mother and college student, she lost her son in a hit and run while crossing the street to their apartment after getting off of the bus at a stop located across a divided highway. She was convicted by an all-white jury of reckless conduct, improperly crossing a roadway, and second-degree homicide. The man who killed her son was later found and admitted to drinking and taking painkillers on the night he killed her son. In the context of arrested mobility, and I can provide similar stats from Utah, I wish it ended with just walking and running. Unfortunately, it does not. It also translates into cycling. And some of the more recent studies on cycling come out of Tampa, Oakland, and the city of Chicago. In the case of Tampa, between 2003 and 2015, Tampa police issued over 10,000 bicycle tickets. 79% of those tickets were issued to Black people, although they make up only 26% of Tampa's population. In Oakland, California, again, one of the most progressive cities in America, 60% of all bicycle stops included by Black cyclists, though the city of Oakland's population is only about 25% Black. Twice as many bicycle tickets are written in majority Black neighborhoods than in majority white or Latino neighborhoods in the city of Chicago. In fact, 321 tickets were issued in a low-income majority Black community in Chicago, whereas only 5 were issued in Lincoln Park, a wealthy majority white community. 321 versus 5. Why is this the case when you know that overwhelmingly you're more likely to see a white cyclist in Chicago than you are a Black cyclist? But in the case of arrested mobility, we wish it ended there. Unfortunately, it does not. It also goes into transit. And one of the most recent and notable cases of that include the killing of Oscar Grant III, who's a 22-year-old Black man murdered by BART police officers in Oakland. But what does the data say? Well, a study from New York showed that while the number of turnstile arrests have decreased significantly, what has not changed is who gets arrested. 89% of those arrested are Black and Hispanic. Also, the top 10 neighborhoods in New York with the highest number of arrests per subway swipe were all predominantly Black or Hispanic. And then there's Adrian Napier, a Black teenager who was tackled and aimed at by a 10 police officer for fare evasion. The fare was only $2.75. Then in 2017, Blacks were 8 times more likely in Portland than whites to be charged for certain transit violations. Thankfully, that policy was later decriminalized in 2018. But when it comes to arrested mobility, we wish it ended with biking and walking. We wish it ended with public transit, but unfortunately, it does not. It also goes into over-policing Black mobility via driving as well. And this includes the notable cases of Philando Castile and Sandra Bland. But what does the data say? Well, when it comes to driving, a nationwide quantitative analysis of police trends in traffic stops showed that Blacks and Hispanics are stopped disproportionately to white drivers, even though the hit rate of white and Black drivers are similar, are similar. But here's also something that was shocking. Police are less likely to pull over Black drivers at the dusk when the race of the driver is less obvious to police. And then in other studies, what we find out of Minnesota, these state commission studies, is that Blacks and Latinos were 7 times more likely to be stopped by police than whites by whites in majority neighborhoods, excuse me. And then in 2016, 47% of arrests by the St. Anthony Police Department were of Black individuals, even though the patrolled area is only about 7% Black. Now I bring up Minnesota, and specifically Minneapolis, St. Paul area, because you all know what took place there. But in the context of arrested mobility, we wish it ended, even at driving. Unfortunately, it does not. It also extends over to ride sharing, with researchers from Stanford, MIT, and the University of Washington found that ride sharing drivers discriminate based on race and gender. And what the data showed is that of the 581 app-hailing trips recorded, Black travelers waited on average 20% longer than white travelers to have their ride accepted on Lyft or UberX. It also took about 30% longer for Black travelers to be picked up than white travelers. See, I wish it ended at ride sharing. Unfortunately, it does not, because there's the case of Breonna Taylor and the case of Tamir Rice. But now, hopefully you see the case for arrested mobility is strong. And a lot of it has to do with transportation. The question is, how can we create a safe, equitable, and inclusive system for all? Step number 1, you must adhere to a justice framework. And in that justice framework, we're talking about distributive justice, procedural justice, interactional justice, representational justice, and care. And when you talk about distributive justice, the first question you must ask is, who has physical access to the street, to the park, or to the trail? This is important because research has shown that majority of minorities do not feel that their children are safe from traffic when bicycling in their neighborhoods. It also shows that less than 1 in 4 feel that they can safely bicycle to local parks and trails from their homes. So this shows that proximity is an access. In the case of procedural justice, one has to ask the question, who has influence over the design and the operations and programming of these spaces? This becomes a very important question because minority youth are not usually included in planning and transportation decision-making processes. And then we get to interactional justice. What makes people feel welcome or unwanted in a space? This is a specific question one must ask in Utah, given the small number of minorities in the state. Then we must take into consideration how African Americans are 2.5 times more likely to be killed by law enforcement. So it's not just enough to design it to say they will come. We also have to make sure people feel like they are welcomed. And then there's representational justice. Well, we must ask the question, do people feel their experience and their history is represented in a space? We often hear about how historical and cultural erasure takes place in communities across the country. We know that to be the case in Utah as well. So the last thing we must do is talk about care for the space as well as for the people in it. Because unfortunately, our systems have been biased against women, specifically Black and brown women, and they do not protect the way they should our religious minority groups. And so some of you may be asking, are there examples of successful equity-infused projects that you've been a part of? The answer is yes. And I'll quickly go through one being the Let's Ride JC Bicycle Master Plan, which took place in the city of Jersey City, New Jersey. If you're not familiar, it has a population of around 265,000+, and it is right across the Hudson River from New York. See, in that plan, they made sure from the very beginning that equity was at the heart of it. So we developed an equity action plan, and more importantly, we went out into the streets and biked the community with the community to address their issues. And race and equity was centered throughout, down to how we prioritize infrastructure investments. You can see the map on the top right, highlighting the highest priorities to the lowest priorities. That was race centered. Another case was a case in Trenton, New Jersey, where this community had a problem near two schools, walking, biking safely in that community. They came to us because they wanted to figure out a way to slow down traffic on their streets. So we worked with the community, we listened to the community, and we came up with a unity design that reflected their culture, their needs, and what they envisioned for their community. In short, it led to a reduction of speeding on that street. And as you can see, the beautiful art here shows the importance of unity in Trenton. But that's the framework. Things must happen internally as well. And so internal to your organizations, we need you to become an anti-racist culture. We also need you to develop racial equity action plans, conduct equity trainings, develop a series of equity performance measures so you can benchmark your progress over time, and then develop internal and external equity advisory groups. Why is the equity advisory group necessary? Because you need someone to hold you accountable. And see, I know this is possible for Utah because I've seen progress. And I've seen progress specifically within the health systems, where they announced a collaboration to address health inequities and disparities exposed by COVID-19. But as you know, in the context of transportation and mobilities, we should say caused by or exposed by transportation decision-making. And so now I've moved you from a framework to an internal or two internal considerations. I now want to show you how you can center equity within your transportation decision-making. This would include the importance of looking at racial equity, modal equity, procedural equity, language equity, gender equity, spatial equity, and my favorite equity of all, common sense. So here are a series of action items for you. The first one is going to be commit to an equity through the adoption of a racial equity action plan. I didn't say equity action plan. I said specifically racial one. This is important, and many organizations have done it, starting with the city of Oakland, Boeing as a company have done it, and many others. So there are examples around the country for you. Caltrans even issued a statement recently. Action number 2, prioritize investments and maintenance in minority and low-income communities, but not only the building of these bicycle and pedestrian roadways, but also the maintenance of them. As environmental justice in Title VI would mandate, also ensure the full and fair participation of racialized minority groups. We know that too often community outreach and engagement is a check-the-box process. This must be reversed. And then we must foster more equitable treatments of diverse languages in the public sphere, and we must document and increase the mobility and access for our elderly and persons with disabilities. And when it comes to persons with disabilities, it's not enough to stop at those only with physical disabilities. We must also look to those with cognitive and other disabilities as well. And then given how male-centric our design, our programming, and decision-making have been historically, it's important that we engage with women and female-headed households to deepen our understanding of their behavior and usage differences as well. And this is true too for our foreign-born populations. As you know, in Utah, given the rise in your foreign-born population, how important this is. But we can't just stop in the context of the public right-of-way from a roadway standpoint. We must also evaluate and mitigate the unintended consequences of improved mobility and access. If we know the investments may or may not lead to gentrification, we must work to prevent it from happening. This is important because trees planted in minority communities usually mature just in time for gentrification to take place. Next, what we must do though, action 9, is analyze the impact of past and current zoning and land use decisions. In Utah and in Salt Lake City and elsewhere, as I've shown you, people are literally walled off. We must care about their health and well-being. And this starts by taking a look at our past and current zoning and land use decisions. Yes, 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 it's intentional. And then action number 10, we must safeguard against discriminatory enforcement. I've had a dozen articles I could have shown about how minorities are over-policed or policed in the state of Utah. Or should I say how they are disproportionately policed in the state of Utah. The point being is that we have a moral and a professional obligation to seek justice. And we have to do so, why? Because justice is what love looks like in public. I want to thank you for your time. Here's my contact information. I look forward to engaging in the Q&A with you. Please feel free to ask any and all questions. And I'll leave you with, I am because we are. Thank you. Take care.
Charles, thank you so much. That's such a profound and perhaps heavy for some of our audience members presentation to just kind of reflect back and kind of acknowledge some of these things. So I really appreciate that. We're getting kind of flooded with the Q&A, some awesome questions that are coming in. Emily and I are going to just start off with a quick little discussion first, just 2 quick questions that kind of tie into our work here at UDOT. So Emily, do you want to ask our first question?
Yeah, sure. So Carlos Braceras, the executive director at UDOT, recently wrote an article on equity. And I'm just going to take the time to quote him for a second. Many of us have never lived in a situation where we have seen the impact of racism in people's lives. And because we haven't seen it or experienced it ourselves, we don't think much about it and prefer to live our lives blindly, believing that racism doesn't really exist. So Charles, when we have these conversations and hear presentations like yours, I think back to this quote, and I just wonder, like, do you have any strategies to help daylight these issues for people who may not have had these conversations at all, or maybe thinking like, I still don't understand how this impacts me?
Yeah, so I want to thank, Carlos for that. I read that piece and I thought it was a really, really great piece. Carlos can point out to, how privileged one is to not have to deal with matters of race and racism. And I want to revise that, not matters of race, but matters of racism. Because as we know, racism gave birth to race in this country. So what we're dealing with when we move further upstream is not in matter or issues of race, we're dealing with issues of racism. And so the way that we do that, I don't think is the job of the people who have been oppressed to educate those who have oppressed them. I think it's those who have systematically oppressed people to look at the damage that has been done and to now create policy systems and environmental changes that could hopefully overcome this pain, this trauma, and this harmful impacts on people. There is plenty of literature out there, studies, books that have talked about the ways in which we have oppressed people locally, regionally, and nationally. And I strongly believe that those like Carlos who really want to make a change will seek that information and bring it back home and make that change. Others will simply plead ignorance and continue to let the status quo grow. Um, I think we need more fearless white allies, people who want to see justice reflected as love in public. And so those would be the people, and it doesn't have to be the majority of people. It could be a very few people who take up that banter and march towards justice. So it doesn't take all. I don't think we need all. We just need a few brave people. Thank you, Emily.
Thank you.
Thanks so much. Seeing a lot of interest in our chat box. I was gonna ask a question, but we're gonna jump straight over. So Gwendolyn Knobloch, I think I'm pronouncing your name appropriately, is asking, in how far is arrested mobility correlated with poverty versus race? It seems in some of your examples, poverty may be just as strong of a factor as race. Can you respond to that?
It is true that poverty is a strong factor, but I think Gwendolyn has to consider that the correlation between race, racism, and poverty as well. No matter how we shield this, the proxy of income isn't sufficient to explain the racial dynamics that exist and the racial inequity implication that exists within transportation, mobility, and health. The root cause of this is racism, and race thus is the most important factor. Reason being is because I've been fortunate enough to have lived a life where I had a very low income, and now I live a life where my income is higher than most. The treatment that I receive has not changed because of my income, and that is indicative of my race, not my income. And other studies will show, as studies have that recently come out of Harvard, Stanford, and other places, that race is the determining factor. So yes, there are some cases when income is strongly correlated, but for the most part, it is race. And I'll be happy to send links for those studies as well.
Yeah,
Thank
and
you.
we have one more question related to just kind of where you got your information from.
Yes.
So Christopher is wondering, how do you get a hold of statistics around citations, arrest, and race?
Right. So Christopher, Gwendolyn, great questions. The Jacksonville study was done by ProPublica. It was a widely acknowledged study. In that study, they provided the data on race and arrests by law enforcement. They had to in order to make the case that they made. But there are many other studies that have been published out there as well. You can find some of these on Google Scholar, or you can simply type into Google discriminatory policing. You'll find links to a lot of the data that I presented. I was fortunate enough to have an intern who spent a few months working with me, finding these studies, but it's out there for you, Christopher.
Awesome, thanks so much. And Christopher, I think we also have demographic data from Department of Public Safety on arrests and crashes and those sorts of things. So we'll definitely, just as an FYI, if we do not get to your question or your comment in the chat, we'll be responding to those and putting them in our Move Utah email kind of follow up as part of this.
So how about this, Heidi? So that we get to everyone, let's ask the question rapid fire, and I'll answer rapid fire, because we want to try to get to everyone, okay? All right.
Okay. I have one from Greg Sanchez. As a Hispanic living in a walled-off community in Salt Lake and as a transportation engineer, how can we hold the city and state accountable for implementing equity measures?
That is a great question, Greg. I don't have the answer for how you can hold them accountable. I think what you need to do is show many of them this presentation so that we could have or start discussions around how you and others are walled off.
Okay, and we have a question here from Alexis. Can you give examples of some performance measures to use that adequately measure equity in project / policy development for transportation related projects?
So one question you can look at is percentage of racial minorities injured per year. You could look at access to trails and open spaces by minorities. Those are just a few examples. There are thousands of others that I could share offline.
Great. We'll skip down to Myron Lee. You suggest that the Black community is walled in by roads. I don't understand how that is intentional on the part of the road planners and builders. Aren't people to freely live on whatever side of the street they choose, regardless of where the street is? Can you elaborate?
That's a great question, Myron Lee. What I would have you do is research the history of the transportation decisions that have happened in Utah, as well as around the country. Again, I didn't want this to be a sort of episodic discussion. I wanted it to be a thematic one. And so what you'll find is that in cities across America, many Black and brown and low income communities were basically the places chosen where highways would plow through them. I'll give you a case in Durham, North Carolina, that was the case. You look at, what's another one? I have evidence of around, I think 75 or 80 different cases. I showed you in the presentation, the one in Louisiana, but you can follow many of the state highways and you'll see what this is true. Another thing is that there's an illusion of decision making happening. You assume simply because a person lives in a place that they decided to live there. However, when you move further upstream and you consider the institutional and the social inequities and how they exist and how they inform our built environment, you will see that it's not much of a decision as you think it is. But that's a much broader and deeper conversation we would have to have.
Awesome, thanks. We can actually, to get more at your question and how the Utah context might work with some of our past planning decisions, Myron, there's part 2 of this webinar. I'll make a quick plug, March 2nd. You'll be able to register. We'll have the information for that on our next mailer.
So Heidi is basically saying she's going to back me up with Utah examples of how the system was intentional. Exactly. Go ahead.
Do you have what I'm right here, so let me ask this one. Jay Aguilar is asking, can you point to state agencies that have taken meaningful actions to address inequities and have performance measures to bear that out?
I think many are starting to. For instance, I'm working with SCAG in California, where they are developing an equity plan. Seattle, the city of Seattle has done a great job. Oakland is doing a dynamic job, and I've given you the Jersey City example. There are many others, but I think it's a work in progress. No one receives an A+ yet.
Okay, I don't think we got this question yet from Lynette Wendell. So she says, thank you so much, Mr. Brown. Our Planning Commission hosts a book club to expand our knowledge on community planning issues and opportunities. Do you have a favorite book you want to recommend for them?
Great question. Of course, most people would say The Color of Law. I'm looking over to my books. I would like to recommend Ebony and Ivy to take a look at the role that universities and colleges played in race in this country and racism in this country. Another one would be called Disintegration, which takes a look at how you now have basically 4 distinct Black groups in America. And my favorite book of all time so far, The Warmth of Other Suns. The Warmth of Other Suns by Isabel Wilkerson. That's my favorite book of all time. And there are others. I can send her links offline.
That's great. Hope to read some of those too.
And The Color of Money, The Color of Money, the roles that it's called The Color of Money. I can't remember the second half, but The Color of Money, it talks about Black banks in the US because many people propose as a solution Black banks. This book touches on that. and how feasible of an idea that is.
Yeah, now that you mentioned that, another one that I've heard often was Know Your Value by Andre Perry. Yeah, that's another good one.
Wonderful. Well, I think that we're kind of into our last kind of moments for the webinar today. So Charles, again, thank you so much. We're very honored and humbled to have you here today and to hear about a lot of the research that you've been doing and your articulate way to present these issues. I know that sometimes as a white person, we can be defensive and say that these issues don't exist. And it's kind of easy in the state of Utah to say that because we're predominantly a white state. But I think that you've given us a really valuable opportunity to reflect, to look at these issues and, you know, the diverse communities that we do have throughout the state. So I really appreciate your time today. And again, coming up in March, we have part 2 of this webinar. Charles has framed kind of an awesome historical overview of kind of the national experience of racism in the built environment and with transportation. And we're going to be hosting part 2 that's going to show how these examples are rooted in Utah soil and what we can start to do to change them and move forward to a more equitable future with active, healthy, and connected communities. So please look for this webinar, register for it. We'll respond to all of the questions that have been in the chat. Some of them are a little more UDOT specific. But Emily and I thank you so much for letting us moderate this conversation and be with you today. So on behalf of the Move Utah team, thank you so much. And thank you to all of our attendees for being engaged in the chat box and for participating in our webinar today.